Okay, here we have our next plenary panel on supply chain resiliency, moderated by Laird Burns, Associate Professor of Management Science, UAH. Please welcome Laird and the fellow panelists here on the stage.
So welcome and thank you for joining us. As you've seen today, it's all about resiliency. Even with the Women in Supply Chain panel, it's about the resiliency of women and our diverse groups of people to join us and persevere in working their way toward the top. We've seen a lot of data today, and what we want to do now is talk about resiliency directly. First off, just to set the stage, my talented group decided to have me position our conversation with a story, a very quick story. So many years ago, there was a pilot and a co-pilot flying a helicopter into SeaTac Airport, Seattle-Tacoma. And they were coming in at night, everything was fine until their navigation lights went out. And of course, if you know anything about being a pilot, you learn to fly with visual flight rules when things go bad. So as they were flying in, they thought, well, we'll get up to the city and get the orientation, fly to the airport. But the fog was rolling in Seattle, as is not uncommon. And the closer they got, the worse the fog got. So as they got closer and closer to a building trying to get their bearings, people in the skyscrapers heard this helicopter. And I've been in Chicago when this happens. You go right to the window, like, what's going on, right? So these people come to the window, and they're getting closer and closer. They cannot tell where they are. So the pilot says to the navigator, hey, write down this message, where are we, and hold it to the window. So he takes a marker, he writes it down, he puts up, where are we, right? And immediately, somebody runs to a desk, grabs a marker, writes an answer, comes back and flashes up the answer, you are in a helicopter. And immediately, the pilot pulls the joystick, takes a vector, goes right to the airport and lands the aircraft. And a co-pilot, after finishing the post-flight checklist, says, I have to know, how did you know that that was where we had to go and what that was? He said, it's simple. It was a technically correct answer and completely useless. That had to be the Microsoft building. And from there, I knew exactly where to fly, right? I did get a laugh out of a Microsoft executive, by the way. They do have a sense of humor. But, you know, when we tie that to resiliency, you come into a normal situation and things go wrong, like our supply chains. You learn to adapt. You go to some basic rules. You learn that you have to update your paradigms, and you have to adapt on the fly to changing times. So 2 years ago, I was going to come to the Supply Chain Directors Conference here, hosted by Nick and his team. And 2 days before, as we all know, the pandemic had hit. They had canceled that conference. And so we thought business was challenging then, right? If you think back 2 years, it's gotten a lot more complex. So fortunately, I have the easy job of moderating this brilliant panel. And what I want to do is start off, I'll give you a quick introduction to myself and then the rest of the panel. I'm Laird Burns. I'm an Associate Professor of Management Science. I teach business analytics and supply chain, and I'm the president of Burns Research, where my colleague and I have some AI-enhanced forecasting algorithms to do unforecastable items. We also, at least in my experience, I have about 25 years in industry with 100 and some organizations in 35 industries in 5 continents, which means I can't focus very well, I guess. But as we go through this, we have some brilliant panelists. I'd like you to walk through and introduce yourselves. First of all, Nick did inform us that the smartest of us were actually going to be virtual. And so Raziel is going to start, and then Paula, and we'll go down through the panel. So Raziel, would you please give us an introduction?
Thank you, Laird. Yes, and my name is Raziel, as Laird has mentioned earlier, and I am the Senior Vice President for the Strategic Management Office with the GEODIS. And I have been within the industry in the last 24 years. Yes, I started when I was 12, kidding. But I had several positions within the industry, ranging from various sizes of 3PL organizations in various positions. Thank you.
Paula?
Good afternoon. My name is Paula, and I am part of the Industry Solutions Organization at Google Cloud. So my area of focus is I look at America's markets for anything supply chain and logistics related. Now, while I've been at Google Cloud a little more than a year, Raziel, I followed a similar path. I spent 23 years in enterprise supply chain software. So actually building solutions that like maybe folks in the audience have used over their tenure. That's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Rudy.
I'm Rudy Alvarado, head of global logistics at Kite Pharma. We are an industry-leading company in the cell and gene therapeutic area. Mostly, our two products are Tecartus and Yescarta, which are approved therapeutics for leukemia patients. Been doing supply chain for 6-7 years. I kind of forget now. I usually count the years that I've been working based on the number of kids I have. I'm up to 3 that I know of. Joking. Yeah, and really excited to be here. I think what you guys are doing here at this conference, especially at the Marshall School, is really important, especially today, this day and age with COVID. There's a lot that we need to do for our patients, so resiliency is at the forefront of what we do every day.
And I'm Jeff McDonald, super excited to be back in Southern California. I'm Executive Vice President of Nnr Global Logistics. Stands for Nishi Nippon Railroad. So it's a Japanese-based organization headquartered in Tokyo. And I've been with the company for a long time. I'm one of those really strange guys that got out of undergrad and has been with the same company the entire career. But I've had a lot of amazing opportunities. So I've been pretty blessed and lucky to work overseas. I was based in Singapore. I was based in Shanghai, based in Australia. So I spent 16 years working within Nnr, building out our commercial business and the strategy for APAC. And I've been back in this role based out of Chicago for the last 5 years. And I am a Trojan, got my MBA from there, based out of Shanghai, the Jiao Tong University Gilbert program with USC. So very happy to be here.
Now, I'm Fred Gilbert. I'm the Vice President of Strategy and Marketing at Performance Team, a Maersk company. Some of you might know Performance Team being based here in Los Angeles, but we were acquired by Maersk about 18 months ago. And so I oversee sales, marketing, and strategy for what is essentially the Maersk Warehousing and Distribution Group here in North America. So we do everything from transload to fulfillment, port drayage, regional trucking, et cetera. So essentially a 3PL. I'm super excited to be here. I think we've been involved with the summit since the very beginning. Great to chat with some students out at our booth and see a lot of friends here today. So excited for the discussion.
All right, please thank our panelists for taking some time with us. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And no, I'm not emailing. I'm actually monitoring Whova, trying to watch for questions. Our panelists realize it's after lunch, so they've asked me to ask you to engage us, either coming to the podium and asking questions, posting them on Whova. So I'll be trying to do my best to manage the technology as we do that. So to start off, what we want to do is ask a few questions, and we'll start with the first one, but let me just give you an idea so you can think about your questions. First, what is resilience from your company perspective? And we'll go through that, then we'll talk about it from their customers and suppliers' perspective. We'll talk about what are the key challenges to improving resilience, and if we have time, what's the future look like in terms of work with resilience? So let's start off. Raziel, we'll start with you. What's resilience from your company's perspective?
Well, we're all aware, right? Resilience can be defined without finding out what disruption would be. Disruption is. Laird, sorry, am I coming in clear because I feel like I'm echoing right now? Good. Okay. Thank you. Yes. So in GEODIS, we are aware that regardless of pandemic, disruptions are inevitable. And what we do, and of course in our industry, this ranges from the most transactional issues to global events, such as what we have experienced in the recent past. So for us, it's really how we will be able to equip our customers with the adaptability to withstand those disruptions at a very short time. It's in the imminent requirement of it. So we bank on our people, the ability to have the foresight to sense and respond based on your analogy earlier of the pilot. That's actually where the theory the theory originated from, and in terms of that, how we would allow our customers to if not fully eliminate the risk, but allowing them to continue business operations during a disruptions. And of course, that's also guided by tools and technology that we're also using, the proper use of data as a vital component as their supply chain partners.
Thank you. Paula.
Sure, thanks, Larry. Well, being under Google or the broader alphabet umbrella, we actually had many different groups and organizations. So resilience can have a slightly different meaning and application depending on the group. For example, we have resilience across our data centers, across our own supply chain for connected consumer electronics, as well as in my area on how we help our own customers in Google Cloud. But from a centralized perspective, we all agree and ground ourselves in a focus of resilience through more of a shared definition. And that's the ability to respond and recover from stress. So that could be interesting because it's one definition that can ground us all regardless of our specific area of work. And it allows us to think personally. How do we personally handle and navigate new and ever-changing conditions, such as transition to work from home and hybrid working conferences, leading in dynamic times, or even avoiding burnout? So we can all learn and apply a lot of our own personal resilience and apply that into our own professional area. And for me and a lot of you, that's supply chain. So we see resilience as a skill that can be practiced and cultivated by our own attitudes and behaviors. So if we take that definition from a personal perspective and simply tack on a few additional words tied to our own area of focus, I would use that as resilience now being the ability to respond and recover from stress in the supply chain. So the same definition holds true when we speak about supply chain resiliency from a personal or a professional level. And of course, there's similar tools, behaviors, and approaches we can all take to help manage that.
Thank you. Rudy, your thoughts?
So when I think about supply chain resiliency, like Paula, I tend to personalize things and really take a step back. The company that I work for, our focus, our core mission is to cure cancer and to treat every patient that we can anywhere in the world. And a lot of the patients that we deal with are what's called second or third line treatment, which means you would have already had to go through 2 rounds of failed chemotherapy and had gone through remission in both those instances before you're eligible to receive our product. And so what this means is that we need to execute from a supply chain function globally. We need to execute 100% of the time. Otherwise, we have real world consequences, which typically result in loss of life for our patients. And it's something that I hold near and dear to my heart. I mean, raise your hand if you've ever been touched by anyone or known anyone that's ever had cancer or passed away from cancer, right? I mean, if you start looking at this, unfortunately, many hands start to go up. So, when I think of resiliency, I think of, what can we do? Our patients, our mission, it doesn't matter, whether we have COVID, whether we have political strife where you can't get products into a country, whether flight availability, weather. We need to execute on our function, which is getting product to patient irregardless. So setting up processes, setting up agreements, setting up partnerships with people such that we can ensure that happens. And that's when I think of resiliency, I really put it as a patient focus first.
All right, Jeff, I do want to mention, by the way, there's a coolest socks contest that these guys have over here. I'm out of the competition. But we can't see at home, so I apologize. Jeff, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've heard a lot about definitions of resiliency, and I can give my own, but I was kind of fortunate or unfortunate to get an interesting story yesterday when I was coming in. So I flew in from Chicago, and I arrived and I got my Uber, And beautiful car, brand new Lexus. It was nice. It was great. I was so excited to get a nice car. And so I was driving into to come into campus. And I started chatting with the guy. I love chatting with the Uber drivers. They always have amazing stories. So if you get a chance, just say hi, start chatting. So I was talking to the guy and I was like, man, you're amazing. You got all these 5-star reviews, but you've only got about 160 drives. He's like, yeah, man, I've done that in 5 days, maybe 5.5. I'm like, whoa, that's pretty impressive. Why did you get into it? How did it happen? And he looked at me, he's like, you know what, man? You hear about all this stuff going on at the port? I'm like, yeah. And he's like, I got about 7 or 8 containers sitting there and maybe 15,000 pieces of shirts and things that I've ordered. I'm an importer. I'm a one-guy office. I bought a ton of stuff from Bangladesh. And it's like, yeah, man, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm getting a little emotional because he was a little emotional. And he's like, I paid for all that. My cargo's sitting there. It's all summer stuff. And so he was like, I'm wiped out. I'm done. I don't know what to do. So that's what resiliency is not. And we have an obligation to, be resilient so that doesn't happen. So I think that's really valuable. We impact a lot of people. So my business, that we can have 10 containers sitting, doesn't matter really in the grand scheme of things. But that was his livelihood. So I think we all are in a great field and we can really make a positive impact on the world. So that's why resiliency is important.
Right. I feel like all the good answers have been taken now that I sit at the end here. But I sat at a very similar conference 10 years ago in Hong Kong, right after the Fukushima nuclear disaster, and talked on a similar panel about, I think then we called it, mitigating supply chain disruption or something, but essentially resiliency. And I think, when I look at how we're responding and trying to be more resilient, it really comes down to it's just business, right? It's just what we do, what we have to do for our customers, right? To the examples that my colleagues talked about, in order to ensure that we can execute and provide and deliver materials and supplies and products to the end consumer. So from a Nnr's perspective, we're doing a lot of listening to our customers to understand what they're going through, how they're responding, what resilience means to them, and then adapting that in terms of how we look at our business and how we move forward and be a better partner. We're looking at expanding into new locations, increasing capacity, all things we'll talk about in a little bit more detail later, but those are some of the tactical things that you have to do in order to be more resilient, for your customers and ensure you can execute for them, every single day.
All right, thank you. So we have a couple of questions. My Hoover app seems to be working. The first one is, resiliency requires a higher level of agility, which oft comes at a financial cost, such as increased inventory. This person is curious as to who is a decision maker in your organization, who owns that decision. And so what I like to do, we want to keep this interactive, so I'm just going to change it up a little bit. I'll ask Paula, who owns that in Google.
Well, it's a different thing going back to the point that I made about the different departments, right? So we talk about inventory. Actually, not my area, so I actually don't know that when it comes to connected consumer devices and things like that. So I get the get out of jail free card on that one. But I think in general, we see this across all of our enterprise customers. And everything becomes a trade-off, whether it is the agility in terms of beefing up your inventory. Right? You think about it now of organizations that said, let's just continue to bring more and more stock in, right? Let's absolutely buffer it in. But it's a balancing act. And so at least within our organization, it falls to a different department. But we certainly see that as an ongoing balancing act across the customers that we see.
All right, Fred said all the good answers were taken. So Fred, you get to go next. And
yeah, I think, there's certainly an executive somewhere that ultimately owns that, right? Within our organization, it's probably our CEO. But I think, all of us ultimately own it in terms of what we do every day and giving our employees the autonomy to make decisions and allow them to react in a way that ultimately, builds a more resilient supply chain, a more resilient partner relationship, so that, when there's needs, and again, the idea is to flex and bend, but hopefully not break, right, as part of resilience, so that can happen in a meaningful way. we're looking at different technology, avenues, right? We have over 20 proof of concepts going on with robotics, with AI, with machine learning as a way to, allow us to be not only more efficient, of course, but also to be more agile, flexible, and more resilient. So I think it's a combination of different things in terms of who owns it, but certainly across the organization, we all have a responsibility.
Raziel, who owns that decision at GEODIS?
It would probably be a decentralized decision-making, depending on the complexity, as Fred mentioned. Sometimes we allow the levels to the point of employees to make those decisions, particularly if it's something that has to be immediately addressed or resolved right away. So we do not take that as a centralized decision unless it requires a really huge financial implication, as the question connotes that there's financial cost, although it's not a cost in inventory for us. It's the cost of providing the service or the business, because that would be additional cost for the organization as well.
All right, Rudy.
So this is really easy to answer. Kite Pharma is very different than most other biotech companies and biopharma companies. Actually, most cell and gene companies this way. We actually don't have inventory because our manufacturing process is a just-in-time manufacturing process. We manufacture one therapy for one specific patient. So, some of these risks and challenges, I agree with the notion online, you can kind of build in resiliency by building up inventory. We don't necessarily have that luxury. And so the way that we have to combat it is, like I said, really making sure that our processes are robust, that we have, backups in place in terms of routing, flight availability, and things like that. We'll see how that evolves. What we can do, especially as we start expanding to more countries. We have a plan of expanding to 14 different countries in the next, 18 months. But yeah, at Kite, we don't necessarily have inventory, so I can answer that fairly easily.
Jeff, what's the Nnr perspective?
Nnr Group also no inventory. We're a service provider. So I think we're very similar on the panel here that we don't have a lot of inventory, so we can't answer the question. But I will add a little context to the thinking. And when we talk about resiliency, I think the question gets to a different matter, right? It gets to agility, which they talked about, being able to adapt. But the way we define resiliency is we also add a component of robustness, right? So you have to be robust first, and that means that you can withstand the shock and continue to operate. Unlike my friend, the Uber driver, he could not. So you need to be robust. And what we think about with being robust as an organization is we call it the 3Ds, right? So we have discipline, meaning that we have a good balance sheet, right? We have decent amount of cash, we have zero leverage. So we're very able to withstand shocks when they come and stay in business. That's the number one goal, right? Keep our customers' products moving. And then we have diversification, right? Diversity is a key thing, whether it's diversity of thought, diversity of staffing, but also diversity of client base. So, and diversity of markets. If China's down, maybe Vietnam's up. If air freight's down, maybe ocean freight's up, right? So we have the diversity, again, to be able to be robust. And we also are very decentralized, right? Which is really unique. This is something we learned going through some other challenges where we were slower to react, but now we call it our Gemba approach. And Gemba in Japanese, it's a key word in a lot of manufacturing, right? A Gemba walk, you get close to the source. The word Gemba actually came from journalism that said, if you want to understand what happens like in a crime, you got to go to the scene of the crime. So we translate that into zero distance between our customers and the decisions on most things. We try to really push that out to all the branches and empower our teams to make quick, agile decisions, but it's robust in that we can adapt super, super quick. And I think that goes to that inventory question because you need to know what you're trying to achieve, right? What are you trying to achieve? If you're trying to achieve a great customer experience and make sure you don't have any stockouts, then that discipline means you're going to have that trade-off, as was mentioned earlier, to have inventory on hand. So be robust. You decide what robust means for you. That's probably going to be some level of inventory.
Also, though, From a business perspective, right? Especially when you're thinking about supply chain, if you're trying to build resiliency into your supply chain, building up excess inventory doesn't always necessarily translate into good business either. If you're ramping up inventory, that means you're also ramping up manufacturing processes upstream, and then downstream, you're also ramping up warehousing space. And in our industry, in biotech, especially on the clinical side, the storage location for these are typically hospitals, USC, UCLA, things of that nature. And they don't have that space. So you can't necessarily build up your inventory there. So you need to really think about supply chain resiliency in a different way.
Fantastic. So one of the things that I teach my graduate students, and we're going to talk about students here in a second, is that there is no one size fits all supply chain. And when I ask this in a graduate exam, they have to define by example the kinds of things we've talked about to say that you have to design your supply chain, redesign your supply chain, tune it to the environment, the circumstances, the industry, be adaptive and reactive, and do those kinds of things. By the way, we have a number of first-year students out here, I believe. Are you guys out there? Stand up for just a second, if you would. Come on, stand up. All right. So this is your first orientation to graduate exams in supply chain. And the next question is going to fit that, because one of the things that I am adamant about teaching, and you're hearing from our speakers, it is always part of a system. It's part of an ecosystem. You have customer issues, supplier issues, economic issues, regulations. You have a whole bunch of things that apply. And so the next question fits this, and this is something I hope the students pay attention to. Do you worry about an overcorrection to the system because of the disruption brought by the pandemic? And this has been a topic of a number of folks here, and the dean talked about it specifically this morning in his conversation. So let's switch it up. Rudy, would you like to take a shot at the correction of the system and any concerns that may arise from that?
Sure. Yeah, so I think about it I'm an optimist, right? So I like to think about things as glass half full. And I like to look at the positives of what happened during the pandemic. Look at the remote workforce, right? From a supply chain perspective, we've shown that we can do our jobs anywhere in the world. It doesn't necessarily need to be in an office type setting or location. So I think that's a tremendous benefit. Gives people a lot more flexibility. Work-life balance is increased, especially, like I said, I'm a parent. And so it's allowed me a lot of flexibility to be able to raise my family and adjust in that. On the back end, for our patients as well, it provides a tremendous amount of flexibility, because oftentimes my work schedule is, mine and my team's is a little bit elongated. And so we're able to provide much more support on a 24/7 kind of basis than we had before in the past. And then the other thing is, I would also, you look at the port, right? Port of LA, Port of Long Beach, and you see a lot of containers just kind of floating out there. And a lot of it is pandemic related. But I think the way I look at it is it's really shined a light on areas and things that we need to fix from an infrastructure perspective, from a process perspective, building in a lot more automation where it makes sense. That's kind of how I think about it in terms of overcorrections during the pandemic and whether we're looking forward to those.
Raise your hand if you played the beer game. The beer game? Not drinking games on the weekend or tailgating. I'm talking about the beer game where you have people are ordering, right? You got distributors.
Do they teach that in the GSM program? You better learn it. Yes, you're going to learn it. Next year, we're going to quiz the students. Make sure you learn this. Both sides of it.
It's root beer? Oh, that's a little too PC for me. I'm okay with that, but just, I think you have a tendency to overcorrect because of asymmetry of information. And I think that's what we're talking about a lot of times here. We just really don't have the complete scope and scale of all the supply chain. So, that game clearly articulates that without clear, transparent information without integration and collaboration, the bullwhip effect is a real thing. And whether that's investment in warehouse capacity, whether that's over ordering, whether that's buying toilet paper you don't need, it's kind of a human nature, I think. So, I hope not, but I'm assuming that there's going to be some level of overinvestment and overcorrection, at least in that regards. I'm guessing that some of this will be inventory overhang and things like that.
Paula, any Google perspective on overcorrection based on the supply chain challenges?
Yeah, I tie it to two different things. One, I think the question tied into a system overcorrection, right? So we're all using level systems and technologies, and how are those configured and adaptable to different situations, right? Our system hasn't necessarily been before. So it's a matter of the back end, how our system's responding. But secondly, it comes maybe tying back to that's need. It's also a mind, right? It's human nature to say, oh, I need to overcorrect, right? Driving a car, and if you end up, human nature tells you to overcorrect. So I think you have to be able to tackle it from whole angle. Otherwise, there is going to be a
All right.
I would just add, I think it also depends, right, a little bit on the industry, right? So I've been talking to a lot of our retail and footwear and apparel customers, right? And if their product doesn't get in and get sold during Q4, which is 60-70% of their revenue oftentimes, right, it's going to sit typically because it's somewhat seasonal and it's going to have to wait until the future, right? And the automotive industry might be a little bit more, a little different, right? And a little bit more stable. So I think it depends a little bit on the nuance of the industry in terms of what that bullwhip looks like and how severe it is.
So as you look at this system view, and this is for the graduate students, you have an overall system, kind of economic system, right? And then you break it down into industries, and then you break it down into competing groups. And so you have different levels of these systems, and some change faster or slower, respond faster or slower, have different material or transportation challenges. And so mathematically, they talk about the system level and then the partial differential equation, that the piece components that can drive that, similar to the butterfly effect you hear about in the movies, right? A small change. They talk about butterfly wings in Brazil, changing a hurricane. Not quite sure I fully buy that argument, but you can show that these small changes can have ripple effects. And the bullwhip effect is real. It's as close to a mathematical property as we have in supply chain. It always happens. You can manage it. But the problem is when you have so many happening at the same time and at different times for different causes and affecting different customers. When we first had supply chain stockouts, and then China started to recover, and as the supplies started to come in, we realized demand dropped, and now all the supplies coming in. And then, demand started to pick up. Well, the containers are stuck in port. And oh, by the way, once they get to the port, we don't have enough truck drivers to transport it. And by the time we get there, that demand has shifted. And so you get many different system level effects. We're going to quiz the students after this because I know they were playing the beer game last night. We saw some of them, right, getting out of the elevator. So we know they're already experts at this. Next question. What type of tools or systems do you use to get an early indication on various risk factors that may cause business disruption? So, Jeff, let's start with you.
That's the one I don't want to answer.
Okay.
Yeah, no.
It's classified, right?
Yeah, it's classified. We use the typical tools. I think the one thing that we really like to focus on, and where I would say that we kind of have put our eggs in this basket, is really that decentralization. It's really that Gemba thought. So we are very customer focused and very customer facing. So we have very good pathways directly to the client and up to central headquarters and back out again. And then we have a global network of really connected nodes and discussions that we have. So I would say we have the CRMs and we look at Panjiva and some of these other areas to look at as far as trade flows. But really, it's we're a service industry, so it's really just what's going on with our customer, keeping the finger on the pulse.
Right. Fred, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would echo some of Jeff's comments, right? I think there's certainly tools and systems out there that we leverage to kind of understand what the forecast looks like and how things are going to change. For example, I was, again, with a customer yesterday, and they're talking about how their e-commerce orders have started to be pulled forward because it's kind of like the toilet paper thing we all went through, right? People are scared the product's not going to be there in time for the holidays. And so they're seeing this big demand now because they think, customers are worried about the product not being there, not arriving in time potentially. And then, we'll see if it turns down. But I think that's just an example of some of the technology we use and try to better understand and forecast what's going on. But ultimately, it's through conversations and relationships and talking to our customers and understanding what they're going through and where they're headed.
Paula, any thoughts?
Yeah, I would add to that, when we think about tools and technologies to help us be more resilient, a lot of that ties first to visibility, and that visibility actually leads to data. Right? And there's a lot of data out there, but challenges that we run into is how to automate it, how to pull it together, how to harmonize it, how to relate it, and turn it into something that's actionable. So frankly, that's some of the stuff that we try to operate in Google Cloud from a data perspective is how can we help facilitate that and make it more automated and more streamlined for organizations so they're not having to figure it all out on their own manually.
Thank you. Raziel, what tools or systems does your firm use?
We use proprietary systems as well as systems that are provided to us as integrated into the tools that we have. But then again, we're not stuck with systems. We also use others like what Fred said and Jeff said as well, that we're generating a lot of research and a lot of data from external resources as well. So for us to be able to use that. And then, what Paula just said, there's so much data. Without the proper use of data, we would really be able to provide a viable solution in terms of contributing to our customers' supply chain resiliency or ours in general. So it's really a matter of what, not a matter of what tools are being used, but how you're using these tools to convert the data into useful information that we all can use for resiliency.
Right. Rudy.
So a lot of what we focus on with our industry is, same thing, forecast data that we also have proprietary systems that we use. Honestly, weather patterns is something that drastically affects us from a day-to-day basis in terms of flight availability, flight changes, scheduling, things like that. But one thing I'll say, and I think this is true in the broader sense of supply chain and logistics in the biotech, biopharma industry, there's a lot of data that we generate on a day-to-day basis. I mean, every single shipment, we have a GPS tracker that tracks, position, tracks humidity, light, temperature, all things of this nature. But we don't really have good systems that integrate that data, that build that data, and that allow us to project or predict what we're going to do based off of that data. One of my very good colleagues here in the room, ex-USC alumni, Ziyu, when I first met her, she had told me about this wonderful technology of blockchain. And I had heard about it before, but we never really we're not really there as an industry to be able to utilize that kind of technology, to be able to utilize the data that we have in these inputs. So, I'm hoping that we can get there as we mature kind of as a company and as an industry, but we're not there yet to use that.
So one of the questions the panelists asked to talk about was, take a look from your customer perspectives and your supplier perspectives. We've talked about resilience from the company perspective from our panelists. Raziel, from your customer and your suppliers' perspectives, what's the different impacts and issues with resilience?
Is it really different, Laird, or is, as we said earlier, it's domino effect? Because we're working as a network of different actors within the supply chain. So whatever happens to one would now trickle down as a consequence to the rest of the following processes. It's still a process that's connected from one to another. So there might be a difference in terms of how they're viewing for their own customers and how it's being viewed as by our suppliers as being the customer. But then again, it's still in the supply chain. It's still a connected effect for each of us and between them and the consequences.
Well said. Paula.
Yeah, I would just add into that point. Resilience from our customer's perspective is how can we help them help manage the disruptions within their supply chains. And we traditionally organizations a lot of into upstream planning, right? Forecasting, distribution, manufacturing, transportation. But we all know that the best laid out plan is going to be disruptive, right? Large and small, from business blocking to traffic industry. That can cover material or labor shortages, transportation delays, rising costs, shutdowns. Actually, even to the point of financial risk or sustainability of an end-tier supplier network. We haven't talked as much about sustainability recently. So from our perspective, they're looking ways to help automate that from a technology perspective, proactively identify that, go through the what ifs and potential resolutions across multiple crises.
Thank you. Fred, your thoughts from the buyer and the supplier perspective?
Sure. So, I think as we talk to customers, a few things come to mind. One, how do we just help them from a flexibility standpoint when it comes to locations and nodes in their network, right? Obviously, the West Coast port congestion has caused a shift to other, East Coast ports, customers looking at Mexico, things like that as a way to flex and provide a little bit more just agility within their supply chain from an overall perspective. And so we're looking at some things that we hadn't even considered before because our customers are asking us to go there and consider that. The other aspect is just, really figuring out how to build in supply chain resilience into the partnership and the relationship. And so we're seeing a lot of customers want to partner in a more significant way, longer term contracts, for example, to really allow us to better understand them, and vice versa, so that we can create kind of these win-win opportunities and be there for them and anticipate where they're going, as opposed to more of a transactional environment. I think that's really important, particularly as a service provider, to be able to offer that and willing to partner in that way. So I don't know what the rest of the group thinks, but I think that's a big thing that we've seen that's very tactical in terms of how we're helping our customers move forward.
So Rudy, from a biotechnology standpoint, your customers and your supply chain is a little different. What's your views on this?
Right. So from a supplier perspective, a lot of what is forecasted or given to them in terms of overall volume is projections, right? It's projected patient enrollment in clinical trials. It's unfortunately, incidence of cancers in populations. And so from our suppliers' perspective, they want us to give them as much, heads up or notice because what we do and how we ship things are very specialized, they're very niche. On one leg, when we do our apheresis process, we harvest blood material from a patient and ship it to a manufacturing facility. Well, we use a specific shipping solution in order to ensure that the temperature is controlled beyond very tight and stringent limits. On the way back, we actually send our final product via a liquid nitrogen dewar. And it's the same thing. Our suppliers really need that heads up because of all the supply chain constraints right now in terms of manufacturing those dewars and getting those dewars back. So, from the supply chain or the supplier side, those are the things that kind of affect them. From the patient side, it's very difficult. Our patients can't, won't, and honestly shouldn't tolerate some of the constraints that we have from a supply chain perspective, whether it be weather, whether it be delay, customs issues, things of this nature. When you're fighting for your life and this is literally your last hope, it doesn't really matter. You need to execute on your job as a company, as a supply chain professional, and you need to make sure that you have this product to me because I may have driven 4 hours to get to this hospital to go through this process. They shouldn't have to tolerate it, and that's what we strive to do.
Thank you. We have a few more questions, but before we do that, I do want to give our panelists a chance to take a shot at this last question. What are the key challenges to improving resilience, and where do we go from here? Paula, any thoughts from Google?
Yes, so of course, a couple of things. Number one, as I point out, we see a lot of the area of information coming from data, right? There's a lot of data out there. If you look at a traditional organization's supply chain, IT landscape, infrastructure of solutions, there's a lot, right? There's a lot of information from forecasting, inventory, warehousing, transportation, order management, ERPs, or frankly, multiple ERPs. So you end up with a lot of just even internal data that needs to be aligned. But now tie this in with community data or your trading partners. And we talked about the bullwhip effect, being able to connect all of that. And now let's also talk about all of these external signals. And we've mentioned weather and traffic and aspects around risk. So there's a lot of data. We need more automated techniques to help streamline all of that and get it to the point of making it actually useful. So we see that as a big thing. The second thing that I would mention is the aspect around risk management. The highest level that it's been in terms of resiliency and business continuity. I actually also think that when we think about the roles in the supply chain, do we end up with job descriptions across the supply chain that start talking a little bit more about risk management skills embedded across everything, not just within an organization known as quote-unquote risk management?
Thank you. I noticed you get some interesting positive nonverbals from folks. So Raziel was doing a lot of good positive nonverbals. She's ready to respond. So I want to hear what's going on. What do you think, Raziel, about key challenges?
Thanks, Laird. It seems like it's kind of aligned with what I was going to say, because Paula was looking at it in a perspective that sometimes in the supply chain we're becoming more tactical because of disruption occurs. So there are times we forget to be more strategic and using that data on a strategic approach, that we have so much information that we don't even know what to do with it to begin with, right? So that's one of the key challenges. How are we going to transform this available information, that's tons and tons of it, in order for us to be able to create strategies around resilience, around risk management, and how are we now going to use that instead of just developing and designing, converting everything. So what happens technically, I don't know if everybody would agree with me on this. We start doing that, and then something happens. We forget, we push it back, set it aside, push it into back to the back burner, and then it gets forgotten. Now you get back to starting to become strategic. Then you try to unravel what you have started in the past and you have forgotten doing that. Then you start over again. Something else happens again. It becomes like it becomes a vicious cycle of trying to be more strategic in our approach to risk management, to resiliency, and then all of a sudden it goes down the drain when something happens. That is one challenge, and how can we now prevent that from happening over and over again?
All right, thank you very much. Jeff, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the topics discussed earlier were perfect, and I think the responses were spot on. And I guess one thing I just wanted to say before we finish here is what's really interesting is what Dean Garrett mentioned earlier about how a lot of these trends were in process, but they're just being accelerated right now. And definitely automation and digitization is critical. That's going to continue to happen. AI is going to take a better role at hopefully assessing that data and using algorithms to make better decisions than our flawed minds can make and manage. But I wanted to say one thing that's really fascinating. It was talked about a little bit early on the workforce. Is the theory's always been that, like from Andrew Yang and the team, Elon Musk, that automation would actually disintermediate to workers, but it's actually kind of the opposite, which is kind of weird. Actually, there's no workers, so we have to automate quickly, and so I think that's really driving a lot of this. It's we don't have the work, so we're making big investments and big plays in digitization and automation rather than vice versa. So that's kind of our focus in the near future.
Fred, any thoughts?
Yeah, MIT has an interesting research paper they recently released that talks about all the time and energy that's spent in understanding the risk and the various risks, right? So nuclear disaster, COVID, right? Other supply chain disruptions, and how little time's actually spent on what are we going to do about it when they occur? And they essentially identify 7 fundamental, right, supply chain impacts or disruptions that it can occur. So supply challenges, operations challenges, transportation, communication, et cetera. And not surprisingly, right, COVID, right, ticks every single box except for communication. And so I think when we think about, how we spend our time as organizations and where we put resources and deploy them, realize there's essentially 7 fundamental things that can happen. How are we going to address them? And are we prepared? And how do we tackle those? I think that's really an important takeaway, in addition to, I think, what Raziel said around just making it part of what we do every single day and not putting it on the back burner. Really important.
Thank you, Rudy.
I couldn't agree more with what Paula said. Data. I think as supply chain professionals and students here, you guys probably hear it every single day. Data. How do we use the data? How do we obtain the data? How do we integrate the data, not only with our own system, but within our partner systems? How do we visualize that data? And then how do we use that data? To Jeff's point earlier about the automation point, I'm a firm believer in automation is the way that we can do things in the future. But there's a psychology to it, right? Because when you're giving and pitching to your team, to your staff, to your company, hey, we want to bring in this automation, the first thing people think is, I'm going to lose my job. What's going to happen to my job? I'm going to be, replaced by a robot. But if we change that value proposition in people's heads and say, no, that's not what's going to happen. Rather than you spending 3 hours of your day sifting through emails, hundreds of emails, figuring out which, is important to look at, which isn't important to look at. Now the automation is going to work for you such that here's 20 emails out of these hundreds of emails that you need to focus on. And so now it's really allowing you to do what you're good at, which is, as a human, we're really good at taking complex stimuli and information and making decisions out of that, right? Computers aren't yet good at doing that, so why don't we leverage our human, strengths to be able to do that? And so if you change that value proposition for people and start to allow them to understand, you're actually going to be doing things you want to do, not the things you don't want to do because of this automation. I think that's kind of where we need to get to.
Thank you. What I want to do is shift the focus and ask our panelists a question, but let me set it up first. We have a lot of students here, first years, and you're learning a lot about supply chain. You've got a lot of experts here that you can talk to and engage with, get their cards and talk to them. But as you do this, I've had the opportunity at my university to teach in the MBA program where I introduced a business analytics course. I teach in the supply chain program where we have that course, and I teach in our business analytics program as well. So what I would do for the students is I want to encourage you, as you learn about supply chain, there are so many things to do, but whether you have it in your program or whether you go off script and you go to Udemy or some other program and you learn how to do some more advanced data analytics, I'm going to ask our panelists their advice to you in these areas as students and as our future employees and as our future leaders. I think it's absolutely critical, whatever program you're in, but particularly in supply chain, you have to understand all the non-data issues, and there are just a myriad of those that we have challenges. But we also have to understand what to do with this massive amount of data. So with that, I'd like to, Raziel, ask you first, what advice would you give to our students here today to help us help them to help us in the future?
Yes, and you have mentioned a good point. Data analytics is actually key, but of course we also have mentioned over and over again that without proper use of what we can do with data, and that would also stem out from the experience and the practical applications that we're all providing as part of the panel. We can have, probably this panel can have a discussion of more than 8 hours, and we're not even going to get done yet. But having said that, how are we going to use the data to support the supply chains also as important as learning the data provides?
Thank you. So Fred, you won't be last this time. You want to make
Yeah, I mean, I think I was talking to a student earlier, and he mentioned, we were talking about why he came back to the program here, and was really to gain those hard skills. So the data, the analytics, the math, the engineering. And that's certainly a big part of it. But I think to Raziel's point, right, you need to be able to balance that with an understanding of the business, a client-centric, viewpoint as well, and bring those together in a meaningful way that ultimately impacts the business. The other thing, and this is obviously a great event for it, and I'm a huge advocate of it, is just networking, right? Like, get out there, meet people, push yourself out of your comfort zones, right? The people here that have been around a while are more than happy to help you, right? To connect you with someone. LinkedIn's a great tool, right? So I would take advantage of that, and I think that's just another tidbit of advice, a little off topic, that I'd throw out there as well.
Speaking of that, one of the things you can do as students is look up some of these folks on LinkedIn and ask to do an invite. I'm sure they could use more contacts, and it'll give you an opportunity to watch some of the things that they post on LinkedIn. You'll see some fascinating stories. With that, Paula, I'm going to switch to you. Obviously, Google is an analytics company. I'm sure you have many thoughts on this, but could you just give some advice to our students for their future?
Yeah, I think we talked about data analytics and frankly, the role of data scientists being at the top of the list. But I agree with the panelists that this needs to be a balance. We talk about the data, we talk about mindset, we talk about being able to think through root causes and what ifs. That's all one side. But let's not underestimate the fact that supply chain meetings are inherently collaborative and right? No one just operates everything in their vacuum. So I would encourage folks to focus in on collaboration and communication skills. One thing that holds true to me for many years, I was speaking with a manager of a deployment organization, and she was communicating to me how they hired 5 new demand managers. Wonderful. She said 3 of them had a level of business background, statistics. One came out of the organization themselves, but the 5th one, they hired the 5th with communications degree. Did not have a supply chain background, but inherently for us to run the best supply chains, you have to be able to communicate effectively with others in your organization and across your organization. So don't underestimate the effective communication.
Thank you. Jeff, thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree with that 1,000%. I've been in a lot of meetings where at the end of it, I'm like, okay, please tell me the story about this data. I have no idea what I need to do with this, right? And the students or the actually, the data folks are geeking out on it, and I love it. And I'm like, yeah, let's slice it 1,000 different ways. But, I would say learn how to tell the story, but really understand your business as well, because then you can come and add value to the executives when they're trying to make quick decisions based on your data and your analysis. So understand the interconnectivity of all your businesses and, of all the parts of the business, and try to network internally as well, so that you can pull information in and definitely tell a better story with your data. I think that's key.
Thank you. Rudy?
I'd tell you guys 3 things. The first, bet on yourself. Always, always, always bet on yourself. Trust in your abilities, your capabilities. Know that you can do it. Know what you want to do, and go out and get it. One of the things I started, I did my actual undergrad degree in psychology. Right after college, right after I graduated, I got a job as an analytical chemist. Totally different, completely different industry. I then went into manufacturing and then fell into supply chain. So, bet on yourself. In conjunction with betting on yourself, never stop learning, never stop putting yourself in uncomfortable positions. And what I mean by that is, if you look at there's a diagram, this famous diagram, if, the comfort zone is here, then there's the, very uncomfortable zone. And right in between those two, there's this wonderful place called learning. And if you always stay in your comfort zone, you'll never learn. So, I applaud you guys for what you're doing here. I think, getting higher education, I'm a firm believer in higher education. There's no such thing as too much education. You can never stop learning. And then the last thing that I think, you guys as leaders of our future and future business leaders, is to stay human focused, right? Understand that business, there's the definition of a business is to make money. I think that's what most people think. When I think of it, though, really the purpose of a business is to make human lives better, whether it be by providing apparel or providing life-saving therapeutics, providing analytics systems and services. Just always remember to be, in my opinion, well, for my industry, it's patient-focused, but human-focused. People are people, and that's our most important currency when it comes to, resources in a business. So that would be my words of advice.
Thank you. So it's 3:35. We are right on time. I'd like to summarize, if I could. I had the opportunity to talk to Carl Monk from Starbucks during one of the breaks, and he said very much what Jeff was talking about. We have the hardcore data scientists, and they're fantastic, right? Masters and PhDs in data science. We have executives, and we have people in the middle who need to help us translate the mid-level and take the high level and translate to the senior executives. And so the communication skills, the basic analytic and the mid-level analytical skills are also critically needed, and that's where our students in the business schools fit in very well. So I would encourage you to reach out to some of these folks this afternoon and during the reception, and keep investing in yourselves. Thank you very much.